Welcome back to the discussion, Learning and Your Agency's Mission, sponsored by Blackboard on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Brian Adash, the Vice President of Government and Corporate Business at Blackboard. Now, Brian, before break, we're talking a little bit about the differences between government and private sector training, but there's also some trends that are very similar. There's a lot of similarities, of course. What are some of those trends you're seeing or that agencies really should keep in mind over the next couple years?
Certainly. One of the trends that we're seeing is the move to cloud, and this has been happening for several years, but we expect it's going to continue. There's quite a lot of teaching and learning still happening in data centers versus in the cloud. And the agencies that have already moved to the cloud speak, on and on and on about the benefits of it, right? The primary benefit that you'll hear them talk about is innovation, because vendors are putting all their new functionality and all the new widgets that they come up with in the cloud. And all of that innovation is available to the agencies that have moved. And they're not necessarily backporting that technology to their older versions of their software. And they're able to do things like we've seen during the pandemic to scale. So you can see this with virtual classrooms and the technology that you use every day for virtual meetings in your agencies is that the need for that technology has skyrocketed, and vendors' ability to scale that technology reliably has been amazing. And these types of things are the trends that we're seeing. If you talk to the agencies that are using these technologies the most for their teaching and learning, you'll also hear them say that they don't plan to revert back to the levels that they used them before. So maybe an agency was using the technology at a 20% level. So they were doing 20% of their programs in a virtual classroom, and now they're at 100%. They don't expect to go back to the 20%, Jason. They're gonna stay up near that 100% because they are reaping the benefits of that. Not just cost savings, but things we talked about before about the data that they're able to use to improve their own programs and improve the learning experience and improve how their their instructors are presenting the materials.
I think the one thing we've all been talking about since the pandemic hit is we're not going back, right? Going back to the office, going back to even in-person events we've heard a lot about. But learning is one of those things you do have to find that happy medium. It's one of the things I think I learned from the Coast Guard during my interview with them was around this idea of some people want that face-to-face connection, and the instructors have to understand that, okay, in a classroom, you can connect with people with your eyes, you can connect with people through other methods, non-verbal communication, but when you're online, that's much harder to do. So I think that the cloud provides that opportunity to, as you said, scale up, come back down, find that happy medium. Are agencies yet having that conversation about what is the happy medium? Or do you think that's going to come maybe next summer once things in the pandemic have settled down even more?
They're absolutely planning for it already with their budget cycles, right? They're seeing their savings on travel and expense, their savings on facilities. These are things that Promise of Online Learning has said for a long time, but we've been hesitant to really try it for things that we viewed as being wholly face-to-face. Now, I'm not saying everything's going to go online. It's definitely not. We've already talked about that. But finding that medium is now a lot easier for agencies because they had to try it and they know where that break point is. And honestly, it's been embedded in the systems. It's also policy driven. Some of these courses cannot be put online for policy reasons. It wasn't because of want or inabilities or anything like that.
It'd be interesting to see it as we stay at home, as we get more comfortable working from home and learning from home. Will those policies also be addressed? Will all of a sudden someone go, we always thought that had to be done this way. Now we can do it this other way, which is online. I mean, DoD found that with a lot of their classified work outside of our conversation. We go down a different tangent, but they said, we always did it this way, but do we have to? And the answer was no, you didn't have to. I think you may see some of that happen too.
Well, that's a big difference between the civilian side of government and the defense side of government in terms of education materials. So on the civilian side, it's viewed at a lower classification level. Anything that's teaching and learning is a lower classification level automatically. In the Defense Department, it's much more difficult because things have been stamped as for official use only or CUI over long periods of time. And unraveling that and figuring that out is very difficult. And so re-architecting the content so that it can be more widely distributed to more people who need that material, especially now during the pandemic, is really important to relook at.
Brian, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the current state and how it's being evolved, but agencies now have to take a half a step back and say, okay, what do I want the future to look like? How do I modernize? How do I upgrade these systems, whether it's education technology or learning management systems? What are some of those considerations that you all would recommend from Blackboard's perspective?
So one of the things that comes to mind right away from what we just talked about in terms of, how do you engage the learners is accessibility. So the government is a leader in accessibility, 508 compliancy. The government has led on this. The user interfaces of these technologies have to be 508 compliant. That's a given. What about the content? How do we deliver the content in a way where we're meeting the learner the best way that they learn? So if you're thinking about flipping through a PowerPoint to get to a quiz at the end, that's one type of presentation of content. What about audio files, video? What about translating it into different languages? What about having an online reader? So as you're reading it, it's highlighting with you. These technologies exist today and improve not just accessibility for accessibility's sake, but also they help the learner, right? You're meeting them where they learn best. And that's gonna be what helps overall. So accessibility is really, really critical in all of this too. The other thing I would say is open standards. We know that there's going to be lots of tooling in a learning ecosystem. It's not going to be any one system that can do everything that the agency needs. We've talked about all different kinds of use cases and workflows, and that's going to take an ecosystem of tools. You need to make sure that everything that's in that ecosystem follows open standards so that things can work together. And so we're not locking ourselves into technology decisions that we have to live with for 10 years because we can't evolve as innovation is happening. And right now, innovation is happening in the education space because it has to. So if you want your agency to reap the benefits of that, we have to make sure we're choosing technologies that are open by nature and understand that there are not a one size fits all and that they're part of a larger ecosystem where things have to work together. The last thing I'll say about things to consider is that we've seen a tendency towards trying to recreate commercial offerings within government. This is really tricky slope to go down for the same reasons. Government agencies that pick up free technologies and then put them in the cloud and then hire an integrator to maintain them and then hire a separate integrator to implement them and customize them and then a separate integrator to support them. That's GOTS, government off the shelf, where we have COTS, commercial off the shelf, that's already done that at scale for thousands of customers at a lower price point. So we just really need to think about what we're trying to do for not just the short term, but also the long term, and make sure that we're making good, solid long-term decisions for our learners, for our instructors, and being able to get them the best innovation over time and not locking into something that's a one-off.
You want to go back to the accessibility piece for a second and kind of meeting the learners the way they learn best. One of the things that you as you bring up online readers, different languages, audio, video, is this community also starting to say, okay, how can AI and machine learning start to help us? Where does that fit into the discussion of helping learners learn better?
Absolutely. So a lot of times you'll see in learning management systems, reporting is like a separate tab, a separate module, or maybe an agency has like a separate reporting place where they're trying to figure out what's going on and do the analysis. We're really focused on providing that context in the flow of the work. So for example, if I'm an instructor of a class, that I can see who are my engaged, unengaged learners through actual metrics in the system. And I know where to focus my efforts to engage them if they're not already. At a broader scale, you could say, you know, who are my engaged employees? Because you could use this technology across more than just your courses, of course. So yes, I think that it's not just about AI, it's about AI in the flow of the work you're doing in context so that you can adjust in real time to make sure that every learner is successful and every instructor is successful.
Now, I told you we'd get back to the data discussion, and that's what we're having really, because what the AI and the ML and these tools are doing is really giving you real-time analytics. Now, the data goes even further because an agency can say, what's the career path of, again, Susie, or what's the career path of you know, John? And okay, how do we lay out that career path in a way that shows that, okay, if you want to get to a senior executive position by the time, you know, the next 10 years, here's how you get there, or here's a path you can follow. Talk to me a little bit about the data analytics that agencies can now use because everything is moved online, everything's in the cloud, everything is more accessible.
Well, the government's already really good at learning paths. So we already know, like, what are the 10 courses you need to get a certain certification and things like this. So that very structured nature is great for traditional LMSs. What you're missing is the lifelong learning of the employee or the stakeholder in your mission around what do they want to do beyond that. And that's where AI comes in. It's really filling the gaps from what you already know from years and years of doing this really well, and being able to supplement and augment that based on that individual's interests, and being more personal with how you deal with an employee versus these are the 10 courses you need to take. And these are the order in which you need to take them.
I know a lot of what the government is doing is looking at not just that young person who comes into government, but really, as you mentioned, the lifelong learner, because there's always that bathtub effect of the middle career people, and they've been over the years looking at the mid-career people. So I think having that career path, having that understanding of how to get from point A to point B to point C is hugely important. Brenna, we're just about out of time. Before I let you go, got to ask you, what's the big takeaway from our conversation today? If there's one thing you want to leave the audience with about education, technology, and learning in the government, what would it be?
I'm just so glad we're having this conversation. I mean, our people are the biggest assets, right? I mean, in government, it's about how do we, and this last point we were making about personalizing the experience. We really want to keep the new employees who are coming into the government interested and make them successful. We want the people in the middle stage of their career to continue to be curious and to be interested to maybe shift what they're doing and apply their skill sets to a new mission. And being able to pivot is extremely important right now. And we don't want to lose the interest of our knowledge holders, right? We want them to engage with the rest of the workforce to make sure that we're successful over the long term. So I really think that is the takeaway. And I think now is the time, because of the pandemic especially, when agencies can really relook at this and say, do we have what we need? Are we using what we have to make do? Or can we make material improvements now for the long term? And that's really exciting.
All about the outcomes. What's the final outcome you're looking for? Bryna, this has been a great conversation. Let me thank my guest. Bryna Dash is the Vice President of Government and Corporate Business at Blackboard. Bryna, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Jason.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion, Learning in Your Agency's Mission, sponsored by Blackboard on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Blackboard.